Why did House Targaryen wait more than 100 years after the doom of Valyria before conquering Westeros? The question hangs over the entire story like dragon smoke drifting across a dark sea. If Aegon Targaryen possessed the greatest weapons in the known world, if Dragonstone stood only a short voyage from the shores of Westeros, why did generation after generation remain on their volcanic island while 7 kings ruled the continent beyond? As you settle into this calm journey through the complete history of Aegon's conquest, let that mystery accompany you. If you have traveled with these stories before, mention which night brought you here. If this is your first visit, simply call it Night 1. The answer is not simple ambition, and by the end of this tale, you will see that the road to conquest began long before Aegon ever mounted Balerion. The wind coming off Blackwater Bay carries the smell of salt and rain. Waves strike the black cliffs of Dragonstone below, ancient towers fused from stone and dragon fire centuries before Aegon's birth. Above those cliffs, dragons sleep. Their scales rise and fall with slow breaths that release streams of heat into the cold night air. Torchlight flickers across walls carved in the shapes of snarling worms and coiled serpents, reminders that this island is not truly Westerosi at all. It is a fragment of lost Valyria, carried across the sea and preserved through catastrophe. The story begins not with Aegon, but with the Doom. In 114 BC, more than a century before the conquest, the mighty freehold of Valyria was destroyed in a single cataclysmic event. The 14 flames erupted. Cities vanished beneath fire and ash. The dragon lords who had ruled much of Essos perished along with their dragons, armies, wealth, and knowledge. Among the few families to escape was House Targaryen, which had already abandoned Valyria years earlier and settled on Dragonstone. According to family tradition, Aegon Targaryen moved his household because his daughter, Daenerys, later known as Daenerys the Dreamer, foresaw the destruction of the freehold in prophetic visions. Daenerys remains one of the most important figures in Targaryen history despite living generations before Aegon. Her warning persuaded her father to sell holdings in Valyria and relocate westward. Many powerful families mocked the decision. The dragon lords who remained considered themselves secure behind the wealth and military might of the freehold. Then the Doom arrived, and nearly every rival vanished. The Targaryens suddenly found themselves transformed from a relatively minor dragon lord family into one of the last surviving houses with dragons in the entire world. A century later, that unlikely survival would change the fate of Westeros. Why did the survivors not immediately seek dominion over the continent across the sea? Dragonstone gave them advantages, but it also imposed limits. The island was formidable yet small. Its volcanic slopes provided nesting grounds for dragons, but its population was modest and its resources limited. The Targaryens possessed dragons, yes, but they did not possess the immense armies, fleets, and economic power that Valyria once commanded. For generations, they ruled Dragonstone as lords rather than kings. Names passed through the centuries: Aemon Targaryen, Aegon, Elena, Megan, Aerys, and others, each maintaining the family line while the kingdoms of Westeros continued their own rivalries. As those generations passed, Westeros remained divided. To the north, House Stark ruled from Winterfell as kings in the north. To the west, House Lannister held Casterly Rock and governed the rich Westerlands. The Reach belonged to House Gardner from Highgarden. The Stormlands were ruled by House Durrandon at Storm's End. The Vale answered to House Arryn from the Eyrie. The Riverlands and Iron Islands endured the domination of House Hoare. Dorne remained independent beneath House Martell. No single authority united the continent. Ancient rivalries, border conflicts, and shifting alliances shaped political life from the Wall to the deserts of the South. If you stood atop Dragonstone during those years and looked westward across the water, the opportunity would have been obvious. 7 kingdoms meant 7 crowns. 7 crowns meant 7 competing interests. Yet conquest did not come. One explanation is practical. Dragons are powerful, but they cannot govern fields, collect taxes, administer justice, and hold castles by themselves. Another explanation reaches toward prophecy. In later centuries, traditions emerged suggesting that Aegon knew of a greater threat beyond the Wall, a danger requiring a united realm. In the written histories closest to the events, that motive is not clearly stated, and historians remain cautious. Still, the persistence of the story has led many readers to wonder whether conquest and survival were connected in ways the realm never fully understood. Aegon himself was born into this strange inheritance. He grew up among the black towers of Dragonstone, surrounded by reminders of a vanished civilization. He learned the traditions of old Valyria. He spoke the High Valyrian tongue. He trained beside dragons and watched ships cross the narrow sea. Most importantly, he inherited Balerion. The Black Dread was the last living creature known to have flown in Valyria before the Doom. His wings could cast entire towns into shadow. His jaws could swallow an aurochs whole. When Balerion spread his wings above Dragonstone, he carried with him a memory of a world that no longer existed. Beside Aegon stood his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. Following Valyrian custom, he married both. Visenya, the elder, rode Vhagar and carried the Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister. Contemporary accounts describe her as stern, disciplined, and formidable. Rhaenys rode Meraxes and possessed a warmer temperament, preferring music, poetry, and conversation. Yet neither woman should be mistaken for a passive royal consort. The conquest would become a partnership among 3 dragon riders, each bringing distinct strengths. Later generations often tried to reduce them to simple archetypes, but the reality was more complicated. Without Visenya and Rhaenys, Aegon's victories would have looked very different. Why does the painted table matter so much in every telling of the conquest? Because it reveals that Aegon spent years studying Westeros before invading it. The massive table, carved from painted wood and shaped like the continent itself, depicted mountains, rivers, forests, coastlines, and castles. There were no political borders marked upon it. That detail matters. The table showed the land as a single whole rather than 7 separate kingdoms. Aegon gathered advisors around it. Plans were discussed there. Distances were measured. Campaigns were imagined long before they were launched. The image is difficult to forget. In the dark hall of Dragonstone, torchlight dances across painted rivers and carved hills. Aegon stands beside the table while Balerion sleeps somewhere beyond the walls. The kingdoms of Westeros exist before him in miniature. Winterfell lies far to the north. Harrenhal dominates the Riverlands. Storm's End watches the eastern coast. Old Town rises in the Reach, The eyrie clings to its mountain heights. Every castle seems permanent when viewed from a distance. Every dynasty appears secure. Yet within a few short years, kings who believed themselves untouchable would be dead, castles would burn, and the political map of Westeros would be remade forever. And still the mystery remains. Why now? Why, after a century of waiting, did Aegon finally choose action? The sources never provide a single clear answer. Ambition certainly played a role. Opportunity was equally important. The kingdoms were divided, and several rulers faced internal tensions. Aegon possessed 3 mature dragons at the same time, a concentration of power that no other family could match. But as you listen to the waves striking Dragonstone below those ancient black walls, another possibility lingers in the darkness. The Targaryens had survived one apocalypse because they listened to a dream. Perhaps the man who would become Aegon the Conqueror believed that history was warning him to act before another arrived. Why did the First Lord surrender before Aegon had truly conquered anything? It is one of the strangest features of the opening campaign. When people remember the Conquest, they remember burning castles, dragonfire, and dead kings. Yet before the great battles came a quieter victory. Men who had never seen Balerion already chose submission. They abandoned rulers whose dynasties stretched back thousands of years and swore oaths to a foreign dragon lord from an island off the coast. Understanding the decision reveals how the conquest truly began. The place where everything started was not King's Landing, because King's Landing did not yet exist. In the year later, counted as 1 AC, Aegon crossed Blackwater Bay and landed near the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. The location was carefully chosen. It sat roughly at the center of the eastern coast, allowing movement north, south, and west. It lay beyond the immediate reach of any one kingdom. Most importantly, it provided a natural harbor capable of supporting fleets and supplies. What appeared to be an empty stretch of shoreline would soon become the heart of a continent-spanning realm. The first structure raised there was Aegon Fort. Unlike the grand castles of Westeros, it was modest. Timber walls, wooden towers, and defensive earthworks rose above the shore, while ships unloaded men, horses, provisions, and equipment, yet its importance exceeded its appearance. Every kingdom in Westeros possessed ancient seats of power. Winterfell traced its origins to Bran the Builder. Storm's End stood against the sea as a monument to the Durandons. Casterly Rock had endured for centuries. Aegon deliberately built something new. He was not arriving to claim an existing throne. He was creating one. The first houses to bend the knee were not great powers, but nearby lords. House Rosby submitted, House Stokeworth submitted, others followed. Their decisions are sometimes dismissed as cowardice. Yet from their perspective, the calculation was rational. Reports had already spread about 3 dragons. Messengers carried descriptions of creatures larger than castles' gatehouses. Lords who ruled relatively small domains understood what kings often forgot. Survival matters more than pride. The sooner they joined the rising power, the more likely they were to preserve their lands and status. Why did Aegon attract loyalty so quickly despite being an outsider? Part of the answer lies with the men around him. Orys Baratheon stood among his closest companions. Tradition long held that Orys was Aegon's bastard half-brother, though no contemporary document explicitly confirms it. Whatever the truth, Aegon trusted him deeply. Skilled warriors, captains, and administrators gathered around Dragonstone's banner. The future king did not arrive alone. He arrived with a growing coalition of ambitious men who saw opportunity in a changing world. As Aegon secured the Blackwater, events in the Stormlands moved the next phase of the campaign toward open war. The ruler there was King Argilac Durrandon, remembered as Argilac the Arrogant. His nickname alone suggests how later generations judged him, though reality was more complicated. Argilac was experienced, respected, and dangerous. He had spent years defending his borders against threats from Dorne and the Reach. When news of Aegon's arrival reached Storm's End, he did not view the newcomers as an existential threat. He viewed them as another political problem to manage. Years earlier, relations between Dragonstone and Storm's End had not been openly hostile. Argilac had sought alliances against neighboring rivals. At one stage, negotiations reportedly involved marriage proposals and territorial arrangements. The details vary slightly between sources, but the outcome is clear. Discussions collapsed, tensions increased. By the time Aegon landed on the mainland, mutual suspicion had replaced diplomacy. The possibility of cooperation had already died. The break became final when Aegon sent envoys demanding submission. Argilac's response entered legend. Accounts differ in small details, as medieval chronicles often do, but all agree on the insult. The king rejected Aegon's terms and treated the offer with contempt. One version claims he mutilated the hands of Aegon's messenger. Another emphasizes his outrage at the very notion of yielding sovereignty. Whatever the exact wording, the message carried back to Aegon was unmistakable. The Storm King would fight. Why would Argilac choose war when dragons already threatened the balance of power? The answer becomes clearer when you place yourself in his position. Dragon lords had existed on Dragonstone for generations without conquering Westeros. No ruler had ever witnessed a full-scale dragon war. Stories and reality are not always the same thing. Kings trusted walls, armored knights, and veteran soldiers because those tools had worked for centuries. Argilac understood armies. He understood castles. He understood battlefields. What he did not yet understand was the dragon fire had altered every military assumption in the known world. The campaign that followed became known as the Last Storm. Aegon divided responsibilities among his commanders. While he focused on broader strategic objectives, Orys Baratheon led forces against the Stormlands. Rain lashed the region. Winds howled through forests and across muddy roads. Argilac marched out to meet the invaders, rather than waiting behind the walls of Storm's End. It was a bold decision, and entirely consistent with his character. He had spent a lifetime fighting enemies directly. The battle unfolded near the Rainwood under miserable conditions. Stormlander forces fought fiercely. Contemporary accounts describe hard combat, confusion, and brutal weather. Argilac himself entered the fighting despite his age. Orys Baratheon eventually confronted him. Sources differ regarding the precise details of their duel, but the result is undisputed. The Storm King fell. With his death ended a royal line whose roots stretched deep into the Age of Heroes. Yet one final act remained. Argilac's daughter, Argella Durrandon, remained within Storm's End. According to the chronicles, she refused surrender and denounced the invaders from atop the walls. Her own garrison ultimately delivered her to Orys Baratheon, fearing the consequences of continued resistance. Bound and presented before the Conqueror's lieutenant, she expected humiliation. Instead, Orys freed her chains. He married her and adopted the sigil and words of House Durrandon. Thus, House Baratheon was born, carrying the crowned stag into a new age. The decision reveals something essential about Aegon's method. He did not simply destroy defeated kingdoms, he absorbed them. Orys took Storm's End, but he also inherited its legacy. The castle remained the center of regional power. Local traditions survived. The people still followed familiar symbols. The old dynasty vanished, yet much of its identity endured beneath new rulers. Again and again throughout the Conquest, Aegon would follow this pattern. He understood that lasting power required more than victory. It required convincing the conquered that they still had a place in the world being created. As winds battered the towers of Storm's End, and the banners of House Durrandon came down for the last time, another king watched events unfold far to the northwest. Harrenhal ruled from the greatest castle ever built in Westeros. Harrenhal's walls rose higher than any fortress the continent had ever seen. Its towers dominated the horizon for miles. Its king believed himself secure behind stone so immense that no enemy could hope to breach it. Soon he would discover that the age of walls was ending. Why did Harrenhal trust stone more than wisdom? It is one of the great questions of the Conquest. By the time news arrived from the Stormlands, Harren the Black already knew dragons existed. He knew Argilac Durrandon had fallen. He knew Aegon had established a foothold on the mainland. Yet instead of seeking terms, retreating, or changing strategy, he placed his faith in the greatest fortress ever raised in Westeros. Generations later, the melted towers of Harrenhal still stand as a monument to that decision. Harrenhal was the pride of House Hor and the obsession of its king. Construction had consumed decades of labor. Thousands of workers died hauling stone, raising walls, and shaping towers on the northern shore of the God's Eye. The castle dwarfed every rival. Its curtain walls were immense. Its towers rose so high that they seemed to challenge the sky itself. When travelers approached from afar, Harrenhal appeared less like a castle and more like a city enclosed within stone. The cost of that achievement had been enormous. To fund construction, House Hor extracted wealth and labor from the Riverlands with relentless determination. Riverlords who had long resented Ironborn domination found themselves burdened further by taxes and demands. Houses Blackwood, Bracken, Mallister, Vance, Piper, and many others watched their resources flow toward Harren's grand project. The castle became a symbol of power, but also a symbol of oppression. By the time Aegon arrived in Westeros, many of Harren's subjects already hated him. Why did the Riverlords turn against their king so quickly? Because for many of them, Harren was never truly their king at all. The Riverlands had been conquered generations earlier by the Ironborn under Harwin Hardhand. Since then, the region had been governed from the Iron Islands by rulers whose culture, traditions, and priorities differed sharply from those of their mainland subjects. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. Aegon's arrival did not create that resentment. It merely provided an opportunity for it to erupt. One by one, influential houses declared for the Dragon Lord. Among the most important was House Tully of River Run. Lord Edmund Tully openly supported Aegon's cause and encouraged other river lords to do the same. His decision carried weight because River Run occupied a strategically important position at the junction of the Red Fork and Tumblestone rivers. Other noble families followed. What had begun as an external invasion increasingly resembled a civil revolt aided by dragons. Aegon was not conquering the Riverlands alone. Much of the region was helping him do it. As resistance spread, Harren withdrew into his mighty fortress. The decision appeared logical. Harrenhal had been designed to withstand siege. Its vast granaries contained provisions. Its walls were thicker than those of any rival castle. Traditional military thinking supported the choice. Armies could starve outside walls. Siege engines could fail. Attackers could lose patience. The entire history of Westeros suggested that sufficiently strong fortifications could outlast nearly any threat. Harren simply failed to understand that dragons were not part of that history. When Aegon approached the castle, he reportedly offered terms. The exact wording varies between accounts, but the message remained consistent. Submit and survive. Refuse and face destruction. Harren rejected the proposal. Standing atop his walls, he boasted that stone could not burn. It was a reasonable statement when measured against every weapon known to Westeros. Fire arrows, siege engines, and torches had limits. Harren believed his castle existed beyond those limits. He had not reckoned with Balerion, the Black Dread. Night fell over the God's Eye. Torches glimmered along the battlements. Defenders watched the darkness beyond the walls. Then Balerion rose into the sky. The dragon that had once flown over Valyria carried Aegon above the fortress. His black scales vanished against the night, while his eyes and fire remained visible. The sight alone must have been terrifying, yet terror was only the beginning. Why did Harrenhal become the first great kingdom to fall when it possessed the strongest defenses in Westeros? Because Aegon attacked the one thing no castle could protect. He did not break the walls, he flew over them. Balerion's fire engulfed towers, roofs, halls, and chambers from above. Stone itself began to glow red under the heat. Massive blocks cracked and warped. Iron melted. Wood ignited. Men trapped inside what they believed was the safest place in the realm suddenly found themselves imprisoned within an oven of their own making. Harren the Black died that night. So did his sons. The ancient line of House Hoare effectively ended within the burning towers. The damage remains visible centuries later. Travelers who visit Harrenhal still see twisted stone, melted battlements, and towers that appear to have softened like wax before hardening again. No later lord, regardless of wealth or ambition, ever fully repaired the fortress. The scars left by dragonfire proved more durable than the dynasty that built it. The destruction of Harrenhal sent a message across Westeros more powerful than any proclamation. Before that night, dragons were stories made flesh. After that night, they were undeniable instruments of war. Every king now faced the same question. If Harrenhal could burn, what protection did any castle truly offer? Walls that had symbolized security for centuries suddenly seemed fragile. Military assumptions developed over thousands of years collapsed in a single evening. Aegon moved quickly to consolidate the victory. He rewarded those who had supported him. Edmund Tully, whose loyalty had proven crucial, received immense recognition. House Tully became lords paramount of the Trident and rulers of the Riverlands under the new order. The choice was politically brilliant. Rather than importing foreign governors from Dragonstone, Aegon elevated a respected local house. Riverlords who had rebelled against Ironborn domination now found themselves integrated into a system that acknowledged their interests. Why did Aegon consistently raise allies instead of simply installing Targaryens everywhere? Because he understood something many conquerors never learn. A realm cannot be ruled by fear alone. Dragons could win battles, but they could not oversee every village, settle every dispute, or command every harvest. Local loyalties mattered. Ancient traditions mattered. By rewarding Baratheon in the Stormlands and Tully in the Riverlands, Aegon transformed former enemies into stakeholders in his success. Each promotion strengthened the foundations of the kingdom he was building. Yet while Harrenhal smoldered beside the God's Eye, two far more powerful rulers were reaching a dangerous conclusion. King Loren Lannister of the Westerlands and King Mern IX, Gardener of the Reach, understood that facing Aegon separately would invite disaster. The wealth of Casterly Rock and the manpower of Highgarden together represented one of the greatest concentrations of power in Westeros. If dragons could be defeated at all, many believed it would require an alliance of kings rather than isolated resistance. Soon their banners would gather beneath a single cause, and the largest army of the Conquest would march toward a battlefield remembered forever as the Field of Fire. Why did two experienced kings choose open battle against dragons after Harrenhal had already fallen? The question has troubled historians for centuries. King Loren I Lannister was no fool. King Mern, the ninth Gardener, descended from one of the oldest royal lines in Westeros. Both men understood warfare. Both had spent their lives navigating alliances, rivalries, and military campaigns. Yet together they marched directly toward the greatest concentration of dragon power ever assembled in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. To understand their decision, you must remember how unprecedented the situation was. Harrenhal had demonstrated that dragons could destroy castles. That lesson was terrifying, but it did not necessarily prove dragons could defeat a massive field army. Medieval warfare revolved around numbers, discipline, cavalry, and logistics. The Reach alone could raise enormous hosts. The Westerlands contributed wealth, armored knights, and veteran soldiers. Combined, the two kingdoms possessed resources far beyond anything Aegon could field through conventional means. Many commanders believed sufficient numbers could overcome any enemy. The alliance itself represented a remarkable achievement. House Gardener ruled the Reach from Highgarden, tracing its lineage back to Garth Greenhand in ancient legend. House Lannister governed the Westerlands from Casterly Rock, one of the richest strongholds in the known world. Historically, kingdoms often distrusted one another. Rivalries and competing interests frequently prevented cooperation. Faced with the dragon threat, however, Loren and Mern recognized that survival required unity. Their combined army became the largest force assembled against Aegon during the entire conquest. Contemporary estimates vary, but most accounts place their strength at well over 50,000 men. Some chronicles suggest even larger numbers. The army included knights from the Reach, heavy cavalry from the Westerlands, archers, men-at-arms, household guards, and bannermen representing dozens of noble houses. Golden lions flew beside green banners decorated with the Gardner hand. Armor flashed beneath the sun. Supply trains stretched across roads and fields. To those who witnessed its movement, the host must have seemed unstoppable. Why did the Alliance underestimate the dragons despite everything that had happened? Part of the answer lies in human nature. People often interpret new threats through familiar assumptions. Dragons were terrifying, but kings still thought in terms of armies. If 10,000 soldiers could defeat 1,000, then perhaps 50,000 could defeat 3 dragons and a comparatively small invading force. The logic felt sound because it followed the rules that had governed warfare for thousands of years. The problem was that those rules were changing faster than anyone realized. Aegon learned of the advancing host and moved to intercept it. He did not avoid battle. He did not retreat toward Dragonstone. Instead, he recognized an opportunity. If the combined power of the Reach and Westerlands could be broken in a single engagement, resistance across much of southern Westeros would collapse. The battlefield chosen lay somewhere south of the Blackwater Rush. The precise location remains debated among historians, but its name would become immortal. Future generations would know it simply as the Field of Fire. The battle began conventionally enough. Men formed ranks, cavalry maneuvered, commanders issued orders, dust rose from thousands of marching feet. Then dragons entered the equation. Aegon mounted Balerion, Visenya rode Vagar, Rhaenys flew Meraxes. Never before had all 3 dragons been unleashed together against a major army. The sky itself seemed to belong to House Targaryen. Accounts of the battle emphasize heat as much as destruction. Dragonfire swept across dry grasslands and fields. Flames spread rapidly through vegetation. Winds carried fire into formations already struggling to maintain cohesion. Horses panicked. Men broke ranks. Smoke reduced visibility. The battlefield transformed into something beyond the experience of any living commander. Soldiers trained for war suddenly found themselves trapped within an expanding inferno. The casualties were catastrophic. Thousands perished, many burned where they stood. Others died beneath collapsing formations or fleeing cavalry. The exact number remains uncertain, as medieval chroniclers often exaggerated figures. Yet all sources agree that losses were immense. King Mern the Ninth Gardener died alongside sons, grandsons, and numerous relatives. In a single day, the royal line that had ruled the Reach for centuries effectively ceased to exist. House Gardener vanished from history not through gradual decline, but through sudden annihilation. Why did Loren Lannister survive when Mern Gardener did not? In part, the answer lies in fortune. Battlefields often produce outcomes that strategy alone cannot explain. Loren escaped the inferno and preserved enough authority to make a critical decision afterward. He chose submission. Rather than sacrificing his remaining forces in a hopeless struggle, he bent the knee to Aegon. The King of the Rock became Lord of Casterly Rock under Targaryen rule, retaining lands, wealth, and influence. The aftermath transformed the political landscape of the Reach. With House Gardener extinct, Numerous noble families possessed claims that might have justified elevation. House Hightower of Old Town was ancient and powerful. House Redwine controlled vast fleets. House Tarley commanded military respect. House Florent later argued that blood ties strengthened their position, yet Aegon selected none of them. Instead, he elevated House Tyrell. Harlan Tyrell had served as steward of Highgarden. When news of the Field of Fire reached the castle, he surrendered without resistance. The decision proved enormously consequential. Aegon named House Tyrell Lords Paramount of the Reach and Wardens of the South. To some noble families, the choice seemed astonishing. Stewards now ruled over houses whose pedigrees stretched back far beyond their own. Yet from Aegon's perspective, the decision made perfect sense. Tyrell loyalty was unquestioned, and unlike rival claimants, they lacked the independent power base necessary to challenge royal authority. Why reward a steward rather than an ancient noble dynasty? Because conquerors often value dependence more than prestige. Houses Hightower and Redwine possessed immense resources. Elevating one could create a future rival. House Tyrell owed everything to Aegon's favor. Their rise depended entirely on the new regime. By placing them at Highgarden, Aegon ensured that gratitude and self-interest aligned. The Reach remained productive, stable, and loyal, while the Iron Throne gained another powerful supporter. As the smoke of the Field of Fire drifted into the evening sky, resistance across much of southern Westeros collapsed. The Stormlands had fallen. The Riverlands had joined the Conqueror. Harrenhal lay ruined. The Reach submitted. The Westerlands submitted. Yet two regions still stood beyond Aegon's authority. High in the mountains of the moon, a boy king ruled the Vale beneath the guidance of his mother. Far to the north, another king watched events unfold from Winterfell and weighed a choice that would define his legacy forever. Why did the Vale of Arryn surrender without a battle when its castles were among the strongest in Westeros? Unlike Harren the Black, the rulers of the Vale never tested their defenses against dragonfire. Unlike Mern Gardner, they never marched a great host into open battle. Their submission came through a different kind of victory, one fought not with swords, but with perception. The episode is brief in most histories, yet it reveals a side of the Conquest, often overshadowed by burning castles and dead kings. Aegon understood force, but he also understood theater. At the time the Vale was ruled in the name of a child, King Ronal Arryn sat upon the Falcon throne, but real authority rested with his mother, Queen Regent Shara Arryn. House Arryn had governed the Vale since the Andal invasion, when Sir Artus Arryn, the Falcon Knight, conquered the Mountains of the Moon. Their seat, the Eyrie, stood high above the world, on a narrow mountain peak. The castle's location made it nearly impossible to attack by conventional means. Armies could not simply march to its gates. From the perspective of the Vale, there were reasons for confidence. The Bloody Gate controlled access through the mountains. The surrounding terrain favored defenders. The Eyrie itself could be reached only by a sequence of narrow paths and way castles. Even large invading forces would struggle to bring supplies through such terrain. For centuries, those advantages had protected House Arryn from external threats. Yet every one of those advantages depended upon an enemy remaining on the ground. Why storm the mountains when dragons could fly above them? Visenya Targaryen answered that question with a single flight. Mounting Vhagar, she crossed the skies of the Vale and flew directly toward the Eyrie. No army accompanied her. No siege train followed behind. She simply bypassed every obstacle that had protected the kingdom for generations. The bloody gate, the mountain passes, the defensive positions, all became irrelevant the moment a dragon appeared overhead. The story that followed survives in nearly every account of the conquest. Young King Ronald Arryn was fascinated rather than terrified. When Vhagar landed within the Eyrie, the boy reportedly ran toward the dragon in wonder. He asked to fly. Visenya granted the request. Together they soared above the Vale, crossing mountains, rivers, and valleys that would have taken days to traverse on horseback. From the perspective of a child, it must have felt like entering a dream. Queen Shara understood the significance immediately. She could continue resisting if she wished. The Eyrie might survive for a time, yet dragons had already demonstrated their ability to reach places once considered inaccessible. The destruction of Harrenhal remained fresh in memory. The Field of Fire had shattered the largest army assembled against Aegon. Visenya's arrival proved that the Vale's natural defenses no longer guaranteed safety. Shara chose submission, preserving her house and people from unnecessary devastation. The surrender carried important consequences. House Arryn retained control of the Vale. Existing institutions remained intact. Lords continued governing their lands. Once again, Aegon demonstrated that loyalty would be rewarded more generously than resistance. His goal was not to erase the great houses of Westeros. It was to place them within a new political framework headed by the Iron Throne. The Arryns remained powerful, but now they served a king above kings. Why did Aegon repeatedly allow ancient dynasties to survive? Some conquerors seek complete replacement of existing elites. Aegon generally preferred incorporation. The Starks remained in Winterfell, the Arryns remained in the Eyrie, the Lannisters remained in Casterly Rock. Even defeated regions retained familiar rulers whenever possible. The arrangement reduced rebellion, preserved local stability, and encouraged cooperation. People could adapt more easily when their traditional leaders continued to exist. While the Vale submitted through diplomacy backed by dragons, events in the north unfolded differently. There, King Torrhen Stark gathered banners from across the largest kingdom in Westeros. Lords and warriors marched south beneath direwolf standards. Men from Winterfell, White Harbor, Barrowton, the Rills, and countless other regions answered the call. The northern host crossed the neck and advanced toward the Trident. Unlike the Vale, the North intended to meet the conqueror face to face before making a decision. The march itself was immense. The North covered nearly half the continent by land area. Moving armies across such distances required organization, supplies, and endurance. Torrhen Stark's forces traveled through lands already transformed by the conquest. Reports followed them southward. They heard of Harrenhal's destruction. They heard of Argilac's death. They heard of the Field of Fire. Every campfire discussion must have returned to the same question. Could any army truly defeat dragons? Why is Torrhen Stark remembered more for kneeling than for marching? Because history often judges a single decision more than an entire campaign. Yet before the famous submission came weeks of uncertainty. Torrhen did not immediately surrender. He assembled a kingdom. He marched hundreds of miles. He prepared for war if necessary. The choice that made him famous emerged only after careful consideration of the facts before him. It was not a reflex, it was a calculation. Sources describe councils among the northern leadership as they approached the trident. Opinions differed. Some favored battle. Northern honor and independence carried enormous weight. The Starks had ruled as kings for thousands of years. Surrendering that crown would mean ending one of the oldest sovereign dynasties in Westeros. Other advisors looked at recent events and reached a darker conclusion. The dragons had defeated every opponent placed before them. Pride might preserve honor, but it could also destroy the North. Then came the meeting. Across the river stood Aegon's forces. Above them waited Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. The contrast between traditional military strength and dragon power had never been clearer. Torrhen Stark saw not merely an enemy army, but a transformation in the nature of warfare itself. He could fight. He could die. Thousands of his men could die with him. The North might earn glory. Whether it could earn victory was another matter entirely. Before dawn, according to the chronicles, Torrhen crossed the river and submitted. He laid aside his crown. The kings of winter ended. The lords of Winterfell began. Future generations would call him the king who knelt. Some remembered the title as an insult. Others viewed it as wisdom. The debate has never fully ended. Why does Torrhen's decision still divide opinion centuries later? Because it forces a difficult question. What defines a good ruler? Preserving independence at any cost, or preserving lives even at the cost of sovereignty? Had Torrhen fought, the North might have become a legend of resistance. It might also have become a graveyard. By kneeling, he ensured that Winterfell endured, the Stark line continued, and Northern culture survived under the new order. Whatever judgment history offers, one fact remains clear. After Torrhen Stark bent the knee, nearly all of Westeros belonged to Aegon Targaryen. Nearly all. Far to the south, beyond deserts, mountains, and scorching plains, another ruler listened to reports of surrendered kingdoms and burned armies without the slightest intention of following their example. In Dorne, Princess Maria Martell had reached a very different conclusion about dragons. Why did Dorne succeed where every other kingdom failed? By the time Aegon secured the submission of the North, the Vale, the Reach, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands, the answer seemed obvious. No kingdom could stand against dragons. Harrenhal had burned. The Field of Fire had destroyed the greatest army assembled against the invader. Even proud kings had chosen submission over destruction. Yet when Aegon's attention turned south toward Dorne, he encountered something entirely different. There he found an enemy that refused to fight according to the rules dragons had been designed to dominate. The ruler of Dorne was Princess Maria Martell, remembered in the histories as the Yellow Toad of Dorne. The nickname was not flattering, but it concealed a sharp and determined political mind. By the time Aegon rose to power, Maria was elderly and physically frail. Age, however, had not diminished her resolve. When envoys arrived demanding submission, she reportedly answered with remarkable simplicity, Dorne had no king. Dorne already had its ruler. Dorne would not bend the knee. The political structure of Dorne differed from the kingdoms Aegon had already conquered. The Martells had united the region through alliance with the Rhoynar under Princess Nymeria centuries earlier. Unlike much of Westeros, Dorne preserved Rhoynish customs alongside Andal traditions. Women could inherit power equally. Local lords maintained strong regional identities. The deserts, mountains, and river valleys created a fragmented landscape difficult for outsiders to control. Geography itself became a weapon. Why did dragons struggle in Dorne when they had dominated elsewhere? Because dragonfire excels at destroying targets that remain in place. Castles can burn, armies can burn, cities can burn. An enemy that refuses to gather in one location presents a different challenge. The Dornish understood this immediately. They did not seek a glorious battlefield. They did not concentrate forces into vulnerable formations. Instead, they dispersed. When dragons approached, settlements emptied, garrisons vanished. Supply lines became difficult to identify. Aegon nevertheless moved forward. The initial campaign appeared successful on paper. Targaryen forces entered Dorne from multiple directions. Castles fell. Settlements were occupied. Visenya, Rhaenys, and Aegon used their dragons to strike key positions across the region. Sunspear, the seat of House Martell, was captured. Other strongholds submitted or appeared abandoned. To observers accustomed to conventional warfare, victory seemed inevitable, yet the appearance proved deceptive. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. A castle would be taken, Targaryen forces would move onward, then resistance would reappear behind them. Small attacks disrupted communications. Ambushes struck isolated detachments. Local knowledge favored defenders familiar with deserts, mountain passes, and hidden routes. The conquerors could seize territory, but holding it became far more difficult. Every apparent success concealed unresolved problems beneath the surface. Why did Marya Martell refuse the kind of decisive battle sought by other rulers? Because she understood that Aegon's greatest strength depended upon concentration. 3 dragons were terrifying, but they could not be everywhere simultaneously. Every day spent chasing scattered enemies reduced their effectiveness. Every occupied castle required garrisons. Every mile of hostile terrain increased logistical strain. The princess recognized that survival itself could become a form of victory. If Dorne endured long enough, conquest might become too expensive to maintain. While the struggle in Dorne continued, Aegon turned toward another challenge. Conquest alone could not create a stable realm. The kingdoms needed institutions, legitimacy, and symbols capable of binding former enemies together. Military victories had brought much of Westeros under his authority, but political authority required a different foundation. A king could inspire fear through dragons. He needed something else if he wished to inspire acceptance. Why did Aegon travel to Old Town rather than simply declaring himself king from Dragonstone or the Blackwater? The answer reveals his understanding of power. Old Town was among the oldest and most influential cities in Westeros. It housed the Citadel, where Maesters studied and trained. It contained the Starry Sept, the center of the Faith of the Seven before the construction of the Great Sept centuries later. Religious authority and intellectual authority converged there. Winning acceptance from Old Town carried enormous symbolic value. House Hightower ruled the city. Lord Manfred Hightower chose submission rather than resistance. According to tradition, the High Septon experienced a vision warning against opposition to Aegon. Whether viewed as divine revelation, political calculation, or some combination of the two, the outcome shaped history. The faith did not condemn the conqueror. Instead, it endorsed him. In a continent where religion influenced every level of society, that endorsement mattered enormously. The coronation that followed became one of the defining moments of the age. Aegon entered Old Town and was crowned beneath the starry sept by the High Septon himself. He wore a simple crown fashioned from Valyrian steel and decorated with rubies. The choice reflected his character. Unlike later Targaryen rulers who favored elaborate displays, Aegon often projected restrained authority. His power required no extravagant demonstration. The dragons already provided that. Why was this coronation so important when Aegon had already won most of his battles? Because legitimacy and victory are not identical. Conquest can compel obedience. Legitimacy encourages people to view authority as rightful. By accepting coronation through the faith, Aegon presented himself not merely as a foreign dragon lord, but as the lawful ruler of Westeros. The symbolism mattered to nobles, knights, septons, and common folk alike. A king, endorsed by religion, occupied a stronger position than one relying solely on force. The event also helped define the identity of the new realm. For centuries, Westeros had been divided among competing crowns. Now a single monarch stood above them all. Former kings became lords. Regional identities survived, yet they increasingly existed within a larger political framework. The transformation was gradual rather than immediate, but the direction was clear. The Seven Kingdoms were becoming a single kingdom. As ceremonies concluded in Old Town and bells echoed across the city, another project was taking shape far to the east. Along the shores of Blackwater Bay, the wooden defenses of Aegon Fort continued to expand. Merchants arrived. Craftsmen arrived. Sailors, laborers, and fortune seekers gathered around the settlement. What had begun as a military camp was evolving into something permanent. Soon Aegon would create a symbol unlike anything Westeros had ever seen, a throne forged from the weapons of defeated enemies, and a capital built almost entirely from his own ambition. Why build a new capital from nothing when Westeros already possessed great cities like Old Town, Lannisport, and Gulltown? The question seems obvious in retrospect. Aegon had conquered most of the continent. He could have ruled from Old Town, whose history stretched back thousands of years. He could have claimed Harrenhal despite its scars. He could have chosen Dragonstone, ancestral seat of House Targaryen. Instead, he selected the muddy settlement that had begun as a temporary landing site beside Blackwater Bay. From that decision emerged the city that would dominate Westerosi politics for centuries. The location offered practical advantages. Blackwater Bay connected the eastern coast to maritime trade routes. The Blackwater Rush provided access inland. The site occupied a central position relative to the conquered kingdoms, yet geography alone does not explain the choice. Aegon was creating something unprecedented. Every existing city belonged to an older political order. King's Landing, though not yet known by that name, would belong entirely to the new one. It would owe its existence to the Conquest itself. The settlement grew rapidly. Merchants recognized opportunity. Craftsmen followed commerce. Inns, warehouses, docks, workshops, and homes appeared around the original fortifications. people from every corner of Westeros arrived seeking advancement. Former enemies now conducted business side by side. The city became a living symbol of unification long before stone walls and grand structures transformed its appearance. Where armies had once faced one another, trade now flourished. Why did Aegon create the Iron Throne rather than adopting an existing royal seat? Because symbols matter almost as much as armies. According to tradition, swords surrendered by defeated enemies were gathered together. Balerian's dragonfire melted and twisted them into a massive throne, unlike any other in the world. The result was deliberately uncomfortable. Jagged edges and sharp metal protrusions remained visible. Later generations would tell stories of rulers cut by the throne when making poor decisions, though such tales often blurred history and legend. The Iron Throne communicated several messages simultaneously. It reminded subjects that the realm had been forged through conquest. It emphasized that kingship carried burdens rather than comforts. Most importantly, it stood apart from every previous symbol of authority in Westeros. Aegon was not inheriting an older crown. He was establishing a new institution. Every lord who approached the throne confronted a physical representation of that reality. The structure of government evolved alongside these symbols. Offices that later became familiar took shape during Aegon's reign. Trusted advisors assisted in managing the growing realm. Lords paramount governed regions beneath royal authority. Communication networks expanded. Administrative practices adapted to the needs of a united kingdom. None of this happened overnight. The 7 kingdoms remained diverse and often divided. Yet the foundations of centralized rule were being laid. Why did the new political order survive when so many conquests throughout history collapsed after the conqueror's death? One reason lies in Aegon's restraint. He rarely attempted to erase regional identities. Starks remained in Winterfell, Arryns remained in the Eyrie, Lannisters remained in Casterly Rock, Tullys governed the Riverlands, Tyrells ruled the Reach. Rather than replacing every local power structure, Aegon integrated them. The arrangement reduced resistance and encouraged long-term stability. Even so, one challenge remained unresolved. Dorne continued to resist. Princess Marya Martell had refused submission. The initial campaigns failed to produce lasting control. Castles captured by Targaryen forces often slipped from their grasp. Dornish fighters avoided decisive engagements. The region remained outside effective royal authority despite repeated military operations. For Aegon, the existence of an unconquered kingdom represented both a strategic problem and a personal frustration. The conflict intensified after Marya Martell's death. Leadership passed to her son, Prince Nemor Martell. If Aegon hoped that succession would weaken Dornish resistance, events quickly disproved the assumption. The new prince continued the struggle. Dornish commanders maintained the same strategy that had frustrated dragon lords from the beginning. Avoid direct confrontation, preserve strength, exploit terrain, wait for opportunities. The war became a contest of endurance rather than battlefield brilliance. Why did the dragons become increasingly vulnerable as the conflict dragged on? Because familiarity changes perception. During the early conquest, dragons represented a terrifying unknown. In Dorne, people adapted. They studied flight patterns. They identified weaknesses. They learned when to hide and when to strike. Dragons remained immensely powerful, but they ceased to be invincible in the minds of their enemies. That psychological shift mattered as much as any military development. The turning point came in 10 AC at Hellholt, seat of House Uller. Rhaenys Targaryen rode Meraxes during operations over Dorne. What happened next became one of the most famous and debated moments in Targaryen history. A bolt from a scorpion, an enormous siege crossbow, struck Meraxes. The projectile entered the dragon's eye. Mortally wounded, the great beast crashed from the sky. Meraxes died. Rhaenys died with her or shortly afterward, though the precise circumstances remain uncertain. The event shocked the realm. Meraxes had been one of the 3 dragons that conquered Westeros. Rhaenys had stood beside Aegon from the beginning. Together they had helped reshape the continent. Now, both were gone. Historians continued debating exactly how much of the story reflects chance and how much reflects skill. A dragon's eye represents an extraordinarily small target. Yet the result cannot be disputed. One shot altered the course of history. Why does the death of Rhaenys remain surrounded by mystery? Because the sources offer few reliable details. Some accounts suggest she died instantly in the fall. Others imply she survived and was captured. Later rumor claimed she endured imprisonment before death. The written histories never establish certainty. In keeping with the broader traditions of Fire and Blood and the world of Ice and Fire, competing stories survive while definitive answers remain elusive. The uncertainty only deepens the tragedy. Aegon's reaction was immediate and devastating, grief mixed with fury. The campaign that followed became known as the Dragon's Wrath. Aegon and Visenya unleashed dragonfire across Dorne with unprecedented intensity. Castles burned, settlements suffered. The skies above the deserts glowed with destruction. Yet even this ferocious response failed to achieve its central objective. Dorne still refused to submit. As years passed, the conflict reached a strange conclusion. Military victories proved temporary. Occupation remained difficult. Dragonfire inflicted terrible damage but could not force lasting obedience. Then, according to the histories, Prince Nemor Martell sent a delegation to King's Landing carrying a letter for Aegon. What the message contained remains one of the great mysteries of Westerosi history. Only Aegon read its contents. Witnesses recorded that his expression changed after reading it. Soon afterward, peace negotiations advanced and the First Dornish War effectively ended. The realm had been forged, yet one unanswered letter now lingered in the shadows of its creation. Why did a single letter succeed where dragons, armies, and years of war had failed? Few mysteries in all of Targaryen history provoke more debate. Prince Nemor Martell's envoy arrived in King's Landing carrying terms and a sealed message intended only for Aegon. The king read it alone. Witnesses recorded that he clenched his jaw, burned the letter, and flew immediately to Dragonstone on Balerion. When he returned, his position had changed. Negotiations moved forward. Peace followed. Whatever words had been written on that parchment altered the course of the realm. The contents remain unknown. Historians, maesters, and readers have proposed theories for generations. Some suggest the letter concerned Rhaenys and revealed details about her final days. Others believe it contained threats directed toward Aegon's surviving family. A few theories connect it to hidden political realities. within Dorne? The canon provides no definitive answer. The mystery survives because every witness who knew the truth carried it to the grave. Yet peace itself was real. Dorne remained independent after the First Dornish War. It did not become part of the Seven Kingdoms during Aegon's lifetime. This distinction matters. Popular memory often compresses events into a single narrative of complete conquest, but the written histories are clear. Aegon united most of Westeros. Dorne stood apart. Not until the reign of King Daeron II, nearly 2 centuries later, would Dorne enter the realm through marriage and diplomacy rather than military conquest. Why does the failure to conquer Dorne matter so much when Aegon achieved so much elsewhere? Because it reveals the limits of power. Throughout the conquest, dragons appeared almost unstoppable. Castles fell, dynasties vanished, kingdoms surrendered. Dorne demonstrated that even overwhelming military superiority has boundaries. Geography, culture, leadership, and patience can sometimes counter advantages that seem impossible to overcome. The lesson would echo through later Targaryen history, whenever rulers overestimated what dragons alone could accomplish. As peace settled over much of the continent, Aegon turned increasingly toward governance. Conquest had forged the kingdom. Administration would determine whether it endured. The king traveled extensively throughout his realm. Rather than remaining isolated in a single palace, he visited regions, met local lords, and reinforced personal relationships. These royal progresses helped transform a newly conquered territory into a functioning political community. People who had once viewed him as a distant invader gradually became accustomed to seeing him as their sovereign. The royal court itself reflected the diversity of the realm. Lords from different regions served in positions of influence. Regional customs often continued beneath the broader authority of the crown. This flexibility proved important. Aegon understood that forcing immediate cultural uniformity would create resistance. Stability emerged not from eliminating differences, but from managing them. The Seven Kingdoms remained distinct, yet increasingly connected. Why did Aegon's reign remain relatively stable despite the dramatic violence that created it? One answer lies in his temperament. Unlike some later Targaryens, Aegon rarely ruled through impulsive emotion. He could be ruthless when necessary, as the destruction of Harrenhal and the Dragon's Wrath demonstrated, yet most of the time he preferred measured responses. His reputation combined strength with predictability. Subjects feared his dragons, but they generally understood the rules by which he governed. The relationship between Aegon and his sisters also shaped the early kingdom. Visenya remained an influential figure throughout his reign. She advised, traveled, and participated actively in governance. Rhaenys had done the same before her death. The partnership that launched the conquest never fit neatly into traditional Westerosi expectations. Targaryen customs derived from Valyria rather than Andal precedent. The dynasty carried foreign traditions into the heart of Westerosi politics, creating tensions that would persist for generations. One visible symbol of that foreign heritage remained Dragonstone. Although King's Landing became the capital, Dragonstone retained immense importance. The ancient fortress connected the ruling dynasty to its origins. Its black-fused stone, dragon-carved towers, and volcanic landscape distinguished it from every other castle in the realm. Long after the conquest, heirs to the throne would continue associating themselves with Dragonstone. The island remained both ancestral home and political statement. Why did the memory of Valyria continue influencing Targaryen rule long after the freehold vanished? Because the dynasty never fully ceased looking backward. Valerian himself embodied that connection. He had lived in Valyria before the Doom. Every flight carried a living memory of the lost civilization from which House Targaryen emerged. High Valyrian remained part of noble culture. Valyrian steel remained treasured. Family traditions preserved links to a vanished world. The conquest created something new, but it was built by people who remembered something ancient. As years passed, the realm adapted to its new reality. Children grew up knowing only one king. Formerly independent kingdoms increasingly viewed themselves as parts of a larger whole. Trade expanded between regions. Political disputes shifted from conflicts among sovereign crowns to struggles within a unified system. The transformation was gradual, uneven, and incomplete, but it was undeniable. The political map of Westeros had changed permanently. Why do later generations remember Aegon so differently? Because his legacy contains contradictions. To some, he was a visionary who ended centuries of warfare among rival kingdoms. To others, he was an invader who imposed foreign rule through dragonfire. Certain houses remembered rewards and opportunities. Others remembered burned castles and dead ancestors. The same events could inspire gratitude, resentment, admiration, or grief, depending upon where one stood. History rarely produces a single verdict. The question becomes even more intriguing when viewed through the lens of later centuries. Without Aegon's conquest, there would be no Iron Throne, as later generations understood it. There would be no unified realm confronting challenges collectively. Yet many of the greatest conflicts in Westerosi history also emerged from the system he created. The Dance of the Dragons, the Blackfire Rebellions, Robert's Rebellion, all unfolded within the political framework established by Aegon. His achievements solved old problems while creating conditions for future ones. As the years of his reign advanced, one image continued to dominate public imagination. It was not a battle, it was not a castle. It was the sight of the king seated upon the Iron Throne, forged from the surrendered swords of enemies who had once ruled independent kingdoms. Every jagged blade represented a choice, a defeat, an alliance, or a submission. Together they formed the seat from which the destiny of Westeros would be guided. And behind that throne, looming over every memory of the age, remained the shadow of 3 dragons that had changed the world forever. Why does the conquest still feel unfinished even after every major battle has ended? Perhaps because Aegon's achievement was never simply a sequence of victories. Harrenhal burned. The Field of Fire destroyed a kingdom. Torrhen Stark knelt. The Vale submitted. Yet when you look closely, the story resists a simple ending. Dorne remained outside the realm. Ancient loyalties survived beneath new banners. The kingdoms became one, but they never entirely stopped being many. The legacy of the conquest would continue unfolding long after Aegon himself was gone. Aegon ruled for 37 years after his landing, counting from the beginning of the conquest. During that time, the institutions he established grew stronger. King's Landing expanded from a rough settlement into the center of royal power. Roads connected regions more effectively. Trade flowed through a unified political system. Lords who had once viewed one another as foreign rulers increasingly interacted as subjects of the same crown. None of these developments generated the drama of Dragonfire, yet they proved equally important to the realm's future. The dynasty itself endured because succession appeared secure. Aegon had 2 sons. By Visenya, he fathered Maegor. By Rhaenys, he fathered Aenys. At first glance, the future seemed straightforward. The conqueror had established a kingdom and produced heirs to inherit it. Yet the seeds of future tensions already existed within those family relationships. Questions surrounding succession, legitimacy, temperament, and authority would one day shake the realm. The Conquest had united Westeros, but it had not removed the complexities of human ambition. Why did the Targaryens succeed where so many conquerors throughout history failed? The answer lies partly in dragons, but not entirely. Dragons won battles. They did not collect taxes. They did not negotiate disputes between rival houses. They did not govern distant regions. The dynasty survived because Aegon combined overwhelming military strength with political pragmatism. He elevated allies. He preserved local structures. He rewarded loyalty and accepted surrender when offered. In many ways, his greatest talent was knowing when not to destroy. The rise of houses Baratheon, Tully, and Tyrell illustrates this clearly. Orys Baratheon transformed the fall of House Durrandon into the birth of a new regional power. House Tully emerged from rebellion against the Ironborn to govern the Riverlands. House Tyrell rose from stewardship to lordship over the Reach. Each family owed its position to the new order. Each became invested in maintaining it. The Iron Throne gained support not merely through fear, but through opportunity. At the same time, older houses adapted rather than disappearing. The Starks remained in Winterfell. The Arryns remained in the Eyrie. The Lannisters retained Casterly Rock. The Hightowers continued ruling Oldtown. These families carried traditions stretching back thousands of years. Aegon understood that attempting to erase them would create endless resistance. Instead, he placed their histories beneath a broader political framework. The result was a realm that felt both ancient and new. Why do readers continue debating Aegon's motives centuries after his death? Because the evidence leaves room for interpretation. The simplest explanation is ambition. A dragon lord possessing unmatched military power saw an opportunity and seized it. Yet other possibilities linger. The importance of prophecy within Targaryen history cannot be ignored. Daenerys the Dreamer saved her family through foresight. Later generations experienced prophetic dreams as well. Some modern readers point toward traditions associated with Aegon's dream of a threat from the far north, though the strongest evidence for that idea comes from later interpretations and adaptations rather than the earliest written histories. The mystery endures because certainty remains elusive. The wall stood throughout the entire conquest, silent and distant. While kings burned and crowns fell in the south, the Night's Watch continued its ancient vigil. Aegon visited the wall during his reign and met with its leadership. The journey reminds us how vast his realm truly was. From the deserts of Dorne to the frozen forests beyond the wall, he governed lands of extraordinary diversity. Few rulers in Westerosi history ever commanded such a range of peoples, climates, and traditions. Why does the image of Balerion dominate every memory of the conquest? Because the Black Dread embodied the impossible, castles that had endured for centuries suddenly became vulnerable. Armies numbering tens of thousands could be broken from the sky. Political assumptions accepted for generations collapsed within a few years. Whenever chroniclers describe the conquest, Balerion's shadow stretches across every page. He was not merely a weapon, he was the physical manifestation of a changing age. Yet there is something almost melancholy hidden beneath that grandeur. The dragons represented the last living connection to old Valyria. Every year that passed carried the world farther from the civilization that created them. Aegon's victories built a new kingdom, but they also marked another step away from the past his family had lost. Dragonstone remained a relic of that vanished world. Its fused black stone, twisted towers, and volcanic slopes belonged to a history older than the Iron Throne. The years eventually carried Aegon toward the end of his life. New generations grew up beneath Targaryen rule. Children born after the conquest never knew the age of 7 independent kings. For them, the Iron Throne had always existed. The idea of a united realm felt natural. That transformation may have been Aegon's greatest achievement. Military victories can fade, political institutions can collapse. Changing how people imagine the world is far more difficult. And so the story returns to where it began. The sea still crashes against the black cliffs of Dragonstone. Salt wind moves through the darkness. Far below, waves break against ancient volcanic stone, exactly as they did before the Doom, before the Conquest, before the Iron Throne existed at all. Somewhere above those cliffs stands the painted table, the carved map where a dragon lord once studied a divided continent and imagined something larger. Everything that followed, the burning of Harrenhal, the field of fire, the kneeling of kings, the rise of King's Landing, and 3 centuries of Targaryen rule grew from that single vision. In the quiet hours of the night, with the sea whispering below and the memory of dragons lingering in the air, it is possible to see Westeros as Aegon once saw it, not 7 kingdoms, but 1 realm waiting to be born. When you look closely at Aegon's conquest, the story becomes less about dragons and more about choices. Again and again, George R.R. Martin returns to the same idea throughout his histories. Power changes hands not simply because one side is stronger, but because human beings decide what they are willing to sacrifice to keep it. Harrenhal chose pride and died within the walls he trusted. Argilac Durrandon chose battle and lost a kingdom. Torrhen Stark chose survival and surrendered a crown. Princess Maria Martell chose endurance over glory and preserved her people's independence. The dragons mattered, but the deeper story always belonged to the men and women standing beneath their shadows. That is one of the quiet truths running through all of A Song of Ice and Fire. Castles appear permanent until they burn. Dynasties seem eternal until a single generation ends them. Great houses tell stories of ancient bloodlines stretching back thousands of years, yet the conquest shows how fragile those claims truly are. House Gardner ruled the Reach for centuries and vanished in a day. House Hoare built the greatest fortress in Westeros and disappeared within a night. The world Martin creates is filled with ancient names and traditions, but beneath them lies constant change. Every age believes itself stable. Every age is wrong. There is also something deeply ironic about Aegon's greatest achievement. He united Westeros largely to end the endless rivalries of competing kingdoms, yet the very realm he created became the stage for future wars. The Dance of the Dragons, the Blackfire rebellions, the struggles between great houses, and eventually the War of the Five Kings, all emerged within the political order born from the Conquest. The Iron Throne solved one problem and created another. That pattern appears throughout Martin's world. Victory rarely ends history. More often, it begins a new chapter whose consequences no one can fully foresee. The dragons themselves embody that idea better than anything else. To the people of Westeros, they looked like the ultimate answer to every question. No wall could stop them. No army could match them. No king could ignore them. Yet even dragons could not conquer Dorne. Even dragons could not protect Rhaenys forever. Even dragons would eventually disappear from the world. Martin's histories repeatedly remind you that no source of power lasts unchanged. Wealth fades, armies break, castles crumble, dragons die. What remains are the choices people made while they possessed those things. And perhaps that is why the Conquest continues to fascinate centuries after it ended. It sits at the meeting point between legend and history. Aegon appears larger than life, riding Balerion across the skies and forging a throne from the swords of defeated kings. Yet the closer you move toward the details, the more human everything becomes. You find arguments around council tables, uncertain rulers weighing impossible decisions, proud men making fatal mistakes, and survivors adapting to a changing world. Beneath all the fire and grandeur, the story is still about people trying to understand what kind of future they are building. As the night grows quieter, you can return once more to Dragonstone. The black towers stand against the darkness exactly as they did before Aegon was born. The sea rolls endlessly against the cliffs below. Cold, salt wind drifts through the air. Somewhere in the silence rests the memory of 3 dragons sleeping above a painted map of Westeros, while a young dragon lord studies 7 kingdoms that do not yet know their fate. The waves keep breaking against the stone, and the world waits for the moment when history begins.